Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm really delighted to be here. My name is Daniel Medin, and I'm here with Pajtim Statovci, yes, and Rumena Bužarovska for a panel titled Grappling with Social Conventions and Wartime Violence. I'm particularly excited about this event as somebody who's been preoccupied with Central European writing, Eastern European writing, and there's been this extraordinary flourishing, I think, of fiction from that part of the world by authors born, say, in 1950, thereabouts, after the end of the Second World War, who grew up under communism, but also experienced as young writers the radical transition of 1989 and its consequences. And it's led to these extraordinary writers from various countries in the Balkans as well as in other parts of Eastern Europe. I feel like what we have on stage today is a new generation of writers dealing with different kinds of historical transitions and in a body of fiction in its very early stages that is quite exciting and novel to me. So this is really a delight to introduce these writers to you. To me, yeah, it's also interesting because they write in languages which, on the one hand, I think of the expression of the other Europe, that in terms of historical experience and literary experience is part of the European body of literature, but at the same time can be viewed as marginal in terms of the languages that we know well in France or Switzerland, for example, which is to say Pajtim, who writes in Finnish, and Rumena, who writes in Macedonian. So again, I'm very delighted to be here today with both of them. We're talking about two books in particular, Bolla by Pajtim and My Husband by Rumena. And I want to begin by asking a question, since both of these titles deal with, among different forms of love, machismo. You might say that both are confronting a particular visions or versions of masculinity, at times tragically, at other times comically, always uncomfortably, which is a thrill for a reader at least. And maybe we can begin by Rumena asking you about My Husband, which I think it's a delight for the reader, not least because many of these fictions take place in an artistic milieu. And a great example of this is the opening story, which is called My Husband, the Poet. And it reminds me of a scene, or I'm reminded of a scene in, forgive me for this, in Barbie, where there is a man with a guitar, and he says, hold on, let me sing at you, yes. Right? And this notion of not actually addressing the person who's there, but performing masculinity in a certain way. Can you tell us where this story comes from? Because it does so much and encapsulates so much of the spirit of the collection in just 3 pages.
I will be delighted to tell you. First, thank you for having me here, and thank you for coming so early in the morning on Sunday. I really do respect that in the audience. So I was working in a poetry festival when I was in my early 20s. I was a volunteer, and I read a lot of poetry at me by many really conceited men with very little talent who believed that they because they were just putting words in what looked like verses on a page, which were mostly about how they were writing, that they believed that God was speaking through them in some way. So, and it's this 19th century idea of, I guess, of this, this writing in like this fine frenzy where you're somehow connected to the spiritual and God writes through you, which is a complete myth of the inspiration, of inspiration coming to these brilliant, what they perceive themselves as brilliant men. So I had to witness and bear this, and I used to be a very I used to be nicer, I think, and I had more tolerance. And I was young, and I didn't know how to confront this whole thing. I was thinking also, maybe I'm stupid. Maybe I don't understand this. And that happens a lot with poetry. Sometimes it's just a mystification of something, or it's just a lot of words put together on a page that are meaningless, but it feels like, it makes the reader feel like they don't understand that it's their problem because the poet has the stance of this incredible confidence. So that was one. So I read a lot of poetry at me, and then it kept happening. It's just so many of even my friends. They were like, "Oh, would you read something of mine?" And then we're like, "Oh, here's 1,000 poems." Like, okay, I'm gonna have to read this again. And then I couldn't say what I thought because every time I would criticize, they would get really angry, which is another thing in this macho world, that if you dare to say something that you feel or you think, then you are met with violence. And as women, we really know how to navigate this, and so we've learned how to respond in certain ways in order not to get either verbally abused or sometimes even physically if we say the wrong thing. So at one point, someone sent me something horrible again, and I exploded. And I wrote this story in like 15 minutes. It was just something that it had to get out of me. I thought, can you imagine being in a relation, like being married to someone like this and having to like listen to this stuff every day? And so how would this woman, I felt, react, you know? So then so I wrote the story, and then because most of my other stories, and even from the previous collections that I had written, they were somehow connected to this marital unhappiness and these kind of social norms that subjugate women within the family and also obviously within society. And I thought, okay, well, maybe I should just perhaps change the perspective of all the other stories so that they come from the position of the wife who's speaking. So that kind of married, the stories together, in the sense that they all have the same narrative technique. It's all this normally disgruntled woman speaking in the first person, and the first one is, yeah, her kind of basically bitching about her husband.
Would you mind reading the opening of it?
Sure, yeah, I don't mind at all. I met Goran at a poetry festival. He'd started going gray. His hair is now almost completely white. I think he's convinced it's part of his new sex appeal, as he once told me. He tried to make it sound like a joke, but I think he actually meant it. I felt like asking him whether he thought thinning hair and a scalp the texture of melted wax were part of that appeal, but I kept my mouth shut. He can't take criticism. He blows his lid and sulks for days. Then I have to do something to butter him up, such as randomly quoting a line from one of his poems. The other day, he got really pissed when I didn't want to read what he'd written the night before. I don't have the time right now, I said. Tomorrow. You don't have the time for 3 poems? I could sense the anger in the rising pitch of his voice. But I knew that whatever I said, he'd take it the wrong way, so I didn't say another word. Go on then, he said. Hit the books and slam the door. He always says that whenever I have to prepare a history lesson. It's his way of saying that if I really knew my subject, I wouldn't need to prepare. If you know your stuff, then you know your stuff, he'll add smugly. To be honest, I don't like reading his poems, much less having to listen to them, something he makes me endure betimes. When we were still in love and before the kids came along, we'd have sex, and then he'd whisper a few lines in my ear as I lay there panting and sweaty on the bed. They were always about flowers, mainly orchids, because they remind him of pussies, about southern breezes, about oceans and seas. He'd also mention exotic spices and fabrics like cinnamon and velvet. Something about my tasting like cinnamon, my skin feeling like velvet, my hair smelling like the sea, which I know isn't true because my mother once told me my hair stinks. Anyway, at such moments, his words used to excite me. I would get all aroused and feel like making love again. Although if he couldn't get it up right away, I'd have to repeat the lines to stay aroused until he could. He doesn't do that anymore, thank God, and then it continues. Thank you.
Thank you. And it's funny too, because in the story, already in these first few page or so, you can tell that, well, you have a parody of a certain form of masculinity. It's complicated by the woman's own thinking and behavior. And
surely, we fall in love with these men. I'm guilty of it. Not this kind, but yes, I'm guilty.
It's quite interesting too, because I mean, when you imagine, there's more than one form of macho in the world, right? And this kind of like, I don't know, self-regard, masculine self-regard, and it's particularly funny to imagine poetry having currency within those areas when we think of more barbarian versions of it, right? In which anything that has anything to do with art would be pushed away toward the margins and be unmanly, right? To write poetry, for example. But it's curious how that still somehow has some kind of... It's
because it's the artist. It's the artist is male, and then the artist in any realm can be, especially poetry. It was always, think about the Romantics and think about Byron, and it's a currency of love and seduction. So it's in poetry. This is what I'm trying to teach my students now not to do, because I teach at the University in Skopje, and normally students who study languages are like 95% women, and then. That's another story that I'm not going to go into, but it's a social gender thing. So, so they're used to seeing themselves as objects, as muses of that poetry, and they can't wait to have someone write a love poem about them. And sometimes I notice them writing poems, like if they want to write poems, sometimes they write them as if someone is writing them to them, about how they're so beautiful and how they're loved and all that. It's such a toxic conditioning of women throughout history that we've managed to change somehow. But in that sense, poetry, I think, could be a form of macho seduction. You can quote me on that one. Yeah.
Pajtim.
He's not a poet.
I'm not a poet, but I can relate to this attempt to disrupt the norm of masculinity and queerness. And I think that in my body of work, I attempt to do this too. Especially in this book, it depicts queer characters in environments that they were not met, and it tells a story of two men, an Albanian who is brought up very traditionally, very conventionally. He's married and he has a child coming. And one day he meets, while studying at the university, this Serbian medical student, and he gets so mesmerized by this man. And so they enter into this very intimate, brief, passionate affair with each other. But because they have no examples, no one to look up to, they don't have a common language to express what they have with each other. They don't have the acceptance of the society on their side, so they end up being in very claustrophobic spaces for the entire book. They only express their emotions when they are in private, inside a small room, and they keep telling each other that do remember that we do not exist outside these walls because there's no place for us outside here. And they don't have the luxury of choice to be open or not. And
I want to say, just quickly, because you mentioned this, it's beautifully written. And the way that the affair, there's something that is the organic naturalness of the sexual attraction and the descriptions of sex. It's extremely hard to write sex well. And I say this as a reader, not as an author. This is out of experience, because there are so many cliches, there are so many pitfalls. And this is done so matter-of-factly and so succinctly and so accurately. Both the naturalness of the way they come together physically, as well as the claustrophobic environment, because it has to be indoors. It has to be in a small student room. It has to be enclosed in that space because it can't be open for various reasons.
Exactly, and if I might, I'd like to read a passage about this, because these characters have to live in constant fear. They don't have the opportunity to go outside this emotion. And I think that this applies to many refugees, and it applies to me too. I feel like my father, who is deceased now, left me this legacy of worry and constantly having to be on my toes for the next catastrophe to hit. And in this book, this main character he feels very comfortable around danger because he's so accustomed to it. And because of the war in Kosovo, he has to move with his family to Finland, but the war is not over when he gets to escape it. He just finds himself in different battlefronts, and there's no salvation for him. He's never able to look himself in the mirror and define himself and say that, okay, well, I'm queer, and would I get a better life if I would just be open about it? There's no consciousness like this because it has been stolen from him in his background. And I wanted to, in this time of self-definition, I wanted to make space for a character who is not able to self-define because he's so afraid of the consequences of it. And I feel like more than ever, we are almost pressured to choose an identity for ourselves and know where we stand and choose our group. And this doesn't sit well with my belief of constant change and doing mistakes and doing bad things and being a good person can still exist in the same person. Okay, but I'm blabbering now, so I'm just gonna read that.
I'm enjoying it.
You know, we're from the Balkans. One raised with fear never learns to live without it. When you take away its cause, fear manifests, becoming its own consequences, a lingering suspicion, hallucination, and waking dreams. And when a fearful person loses the ability to let go of their fear, fear is then transfigured. It is the neighbor with a better parking space because this is his country, not yours. It is a dog walker nodding in your direction as you pass each other and squinting, and not to say hello, but because you are a foreigner. A checkout assistant sighing while scanning the markdown sandwiches you have bought for the freezer, not out of boredom, but because you are an intruder behaving unfairly towards others. Our girl, Drita, is a kind and well-behaved girl, but our sons get into fights at school almost every day. Their teachers tell me and Oishe that our sons' problems are all because we moved here from Kosovo. It's a difficult situation for a young child, they explain. Living between two languages, two cultures, and religions can cause an identity crisis, and the children no longer know who they are because their entire world is formed from such conflicting customs and practices, they tell us flatly, as though informing us of an upcoming renovation. It irritates and riles us because their words imply that our children's lives are somehow incomplete or lacking in some crucial respect, that because of us, their lives aren't healthy and full, because we moved here to escape the war. To their minds, the fact that our children speak several languages fluently, that they are acquainted with different customs and beliefs apparently doesn't enrich our sons' lives. On the contrary, they see it as a strain.
Yeah. Thank you. I mean, that's a wonderful passage about what I'd call trauma after trauma, the way that experience resides in the person even once they're removed to ostensible safety. And it's interesting too, because in what you've mentioned, I think it's also part of a body of work that extends even to the next generation, and the question to what extent does that kind of fear, does that kind of uncertainty, for example, to what extent does my sense of urgency as somebody who has lived in more than one country, who has more than one passport, that my children have to have that same kind of passport because my great-grandparents escaped a pogrom. Like the way that even from generation to generation, how does it migrate in some ways?
I completely understand, I can relate to that. And to this day, when I walk into a room, I look for the nearest exit for the bathroom, so in case of a need of this sort of escape. And I think that since I was very young, I was a very fragile and emotional and sensitive to other people's attitudes and stereotypes they had towards me. I thought that I knew that I was seen as less fortunate, less deserving, less capable, even less smart than my Finnish and Swedish-speaking peers, just because of my background, just because I had moved to Finland from the middle of the war. And so I quickly lost my stamina to fight, because it's so much easier to adjust to violence than to fight against it. The latter requires so much more strength than just staying in a violent surrounding, for example. But I was so beside myself when I was younger that I suffered from internalized racism and hatred, and I couldn't even go to the library and borrow a book because I was too ashamed to do so for some reason, and instead I used to go to the library and read while I was there, and then take the book back to the shelf and then go home from there, because it closed a lot of doors for me, I think, in life in general, feeling less. But I got my revenge in the end with these books.
I have one other question, just because I started by thinking about, Pristina as an environment and homosexuality, homosexual desire in that environment in, say, circa 1995. And I was a little bit surprised because you just mentioned this is a great place at the moment, or Pristina is being an interesting city in Europe. You return quite often. Could the two of you say something about maybe the difference between Pristina in 1994 and 2024?
Well, I have only been a few times, and there is obviously this taboo in terms of Macedonia and Kosovo, which occurred obviously after, there's an ingrained and traditionally passed Albanophobia in Macedonia. And so a lot of myths come out about Kosovo and what kind of a place it is, and that there's this mafia and blah 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 blah, all this just terrible nationalistic vitriol coming out. However, the younger generations, and I'm just 20s, 30s, people who are in their 20s, 30s, or 40s, they are bridging those gaps. A lot of my friends from Macedonia, they go to Pristina a lot to party. And there's, a lot of people from Pristina coming in and, DJing, and it's a lively city. It feels like it has a very interesting youth. And somehow people in Skopje are a little, we're excited because it's very near. And it's getting that kind of a reputation as, there's always something really beautiful about something new. You can always take it as an opportunity. I work in a new language. Everyone is kind of new in terms of, yes, it was standardized in 1945. So, I don't have a history of literature, a body of literature that I can draw on. Neither do I have a body of language that I can draw on. You know what? I can make that. I have the freedom to not be constrained by all of this history, and I can take it as an opportunity. And I think it's the same with Kosovo, because it's a new republic. It has these youths that are particularly progressive. And so that's how I see it from afar, from having gone there several times. There's festivals, there is a bubbling life, I believe, and that's at least what we think. So, but you know more because you go there.
I completely agree with you. Okay. I don't know if I even have anything to add to this.
I mean, it's interesting too, because you could say that some of this self-repression or shame or whatever that the two protagonists of your novel, that inhabit them, that could probably exist even in a more liberal environment. but it would appear as though Pristina has changed as well. That's also pre-war.
Exactly.
Pristina too, which is, and you can feel the pressure of it in the fiction.
But it's also, right, Serbian and Albanian, which is taboo.
Exactly, exactly. And the character is not fully, this main character in this book is not really capable of breaking the bubble. He kind of takes the world he lives in with him to the new country, which is an unnamed European country, and the same values and traditions somehow apply. And in this book, I hope I'm not spoiling it enough, but at one point he starts chatting with a young man online, and then it turns out that he's underage, and then he gets sent to prison. And because what he does is not considered, it's considered frowned upon, but he doesn't think that he has done anything wrong because it's not illegal in his home country. So he just starts wondering why he's being sent out to prison by having this affair with this young man. And
affair is generous for what happens.
It's not an affair really. It's terrible. It's the sexual abuse of a minor. I should be more careful with my words.
No, but it's actually presented from Arsim's point of view. And so there's a kind of, I don't want to say it's not ambiguity, but there's the way that, as in real life, things happen as a sequence of events very quickly. It's not malevolent. It's not foreseen. It is not, you know, it sort of unravels, as you can imagine it actually unraveling, and in many respects beyond the ability of the characters themselves to conceive what's happening.
The only enjoyment I think he has in this book is the ability to give up in the end, and that's something that brings him a sense of belonging somewhere. And he gets like completely stripped down, and his dignity is taken away from him. He gets sent back to Kosovo after his time in prison, and there's some enjoyment he takes from that because now he's not expected to fulfill any kind of role, and he decides to go back to his writing. This book is also about artistry and being an aspiring writer and dreams too, but in this the dreams are not realized, and you know how when you have something that you want, when you have a dream, you have this motivation and this power in you because you haven't still achieved the thing that you want, and it's a really powerful emotion to have because it keeps you going towards the goal. But if you lose this goal, if your dream if it's realized, or if you just want to disregard it, then you lose the power in the dreaming itself. You know. So then you have to replace it with someone else, and he gets published in this student magazine, and to his disappointment, he doesn't feel that content with a realized dream, because he's much more happy to dream than just to achieve the dream. Yeah.
I apologize to the
I forgot about your question, by the way. It was long ago.
Well, it started with Pristina a while ago, but then went on to, I think, the question of desire and temperament and social pressure. And it's interesting, of course, because in certain ways, I was emphasizing same-sex love as a form of pressure, but as you've mentioned, of course, it's also, in 1995, it's also Serbian-Albanian, which is another form of pressure. It's
taboo even in hetero relationships. It's not just, even nowadays.
Yeah. I think just one other question about character, because I think these books are both strong in their representations of individuals, and particularly strong at, I think, depicting blind spots. As mentioned already, your collection is full of these sharp, intelligent, acerbic women who are often quite conscious of their environment and their faulty husbands. And yet, despite this self-awareness, are kind of, they're missing the obvious that you as a reader can see.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's both. I think there's a lot of women who are quite blind in terms of what's going on, and that's the gift of the first-person narrator. I love writing in that. I mean, especially in this book, I really enjoyed that perspective because what is obvious to the reader is obviously not obvious to the narrator, and that actually is where the humor is created because of the disparity between the 2 points of view. And I think this, for me, the idea was, I mean, I think one of the reasons that a lot of women from different walks of life are reading this book in Macedonia is because they are able to recognize themselves in their faults. Like there's this one story about a woman who finds out that her husband is having an affair.
Oh gosh.
And it's a funny story because she goes crazy, she starts rummaging through his things, like he's gaslighting her all the time, like it's not happening, she knows. She starts doing like this private detective stuff where not only does she try to break into all of his accounts, but then she starts following him, and she
dictation machine in the car.
Oh yeah, it was like she puts stuff in the car. She has of course, the best friend, this woman who helps her with all of this stuff, like the other sleuth. And I think that's one of the stories that most of the women really enjoy when they read it because they recognize themselves in this ridiculousness of this horrible jealousy and just the levels, the extent to which they will go, and also their misogyny, like obviously internalized misogyny of saying, oh, that little whore, it's the woman who's actually who's guilty of the crime. It's not the husband. What you need to do is really take control of your husband, because your husband is your livelihood, and your husband is also your dignity. Your husband is your social status. And so, losing him to another woman would bring shame to the family. And so, of course, in the old-fashioned way. And so, of course, she goes to her mother, and her mother is like, like, you're not coming back to me. And, okay, I know that this happens. This was based, like, loosely on the woman that I cannot stand because she's working for this horrible right-wing criminal mayor. And, but she tried to leave her husband, and, she went to her mom, and her mom was like, you're not coming back home. You belong there, because, marriage basically means I'm going to sell, traditionally, selling the woman, the husband, the dad re-romanticizes, walks the daughter down the aisle, and she's like, okay, now here's this cattle is for you. Now you have to put it in your home. And then, the woman is sitting there in that home, and then she can't go back, even if she's abused, even if, all these horrible things are happening to her. But the same thing, happened to the son, in this, I'm not sure if it was his family or I'm imagining things, but the son got divorced, and the mom was like, oh, please come back home, from this horrible wench that, you got divorced from. So the men can come back home to their mommies, but the women can never go back home, regardless of how, of how abused they have been, because they've already been sold. And I'm talking about a traditional type of idea of marriage. And I'm sitting here in Switzerland as a Macedonian. I don't want to be perceived as someone who comes from a savage Balkan place country, because my book actually works in the West because of the same ways in which these relationships work. It's just that the nuances are a little bit different. And we come obviously from a place that has had a challenging history and a challenging past, obviously. So those things are also reflected in the relationships between people. on the level of gender, on the level of ethnicity, on the level of religion. It's very small and it's mixed up. But obviously the response was very good. Women were able to laugh at themselves when they were reading the stories, because I did this in a way, I tried to do it in a humorous way. Not all of the stories are, of course, humorous. They're humorous, tragic. But I tried to do it in a way so that there's empathy for the female characters and kind of for their blindness or for their inability to escape the circumstances in which they are, because it's a civilizational issue. It's not that easy to be like, oh, I'm going to now leave my kids with my husband. Nowhere is that seen as a good mother, right, or a good ex-wife, nowhere in the world. So they are victims, basically, of history. It's very difficult for them to get out of those patterns. And I understand that it's difficult, so I like to have empathy towards those characters, and which is why I insert a lot of humor in them, or sometimes I punish them with humor. Yeah, that's another way to do it.
And you're correct, because one of the very first things when she discovers and confirms the affair is she gets the phone number of the other woman, and she begins to call this other woman and hang up and harass her. And,
yeah.
And by the way, I won't give anything away, but the ending of the story is absolutely terrific, and it's a climax that is worth arriving at. Can you say something about also, I mean, say blind spots, the kind of writing books in which you have the psychology of different characters who are missing essential aspects because they're unable to look inward in a certain way?
Yeah, definitely. I really struggled with the characterization in this book, and it took me. I worked on the novel for 8 years, and it took me this long because I couldn't find the voice of the narrator. I knew that I wanted the main character to be a person who doesn't come undone, and is not necessarily someone you would normally root for or be on his side. This book, I think, pushes the reader to draw new lines for their own empathy, because he keeps doing these things that are really difficult to digest. For example, he's a very violent man towards his family, and he is a misogynist in many ways. He keeps lying to everybody around him and seems very full of himself in many ways. And myself, like growing up in rather traditional Albanian environments and around people like this who enjoyed causing danger around them. And so I wanted to write about what's it like to be close to someone like this, and I had this need to understand why this man is acting like this, and why are these men like this in the community and in the world I grew in, and I guess I was attempting to find some explanation or some light in humanity, but instead it led me to this really darker path.
Place.
And but I mean, I'm not asking the reader in this book to accept or like the narrator, the protagonist, but I'm inviting them to try to comprehend and understand why some things are more difficult to him than to other people.
I want to get back to something that we alluded to a moment ago, and this has to do with, I suppose, hybrid identity of your biographical experience of more than one language and more than one culture, both in terms of your material and your life experience, but also, I think, to return to a theme from yesterday in Hisham's talk, for example, the role of reading. And reading is, of course, international, whether it's in translation or in the original. It becomes something that we absorb. So, for example, I was very aware in your collection of stories of, let's say, the American tradition of the short story, even while it does have something that feels very localized and particular to your part of the world. The title of your novel is based on a creature that's coming from Albanian mythology, right? And so I wonder if each of you could perhaps talk a little bit about working with those various linguistic and cultural materials to generate something in Finnish, in Macedonian. I
wrote out of a necessity. I think Hisham also was talking about that yesterday. It's just, it's the necessity to produce something that you were so fascinated with, something that you enjoyed so much that it's kind of like, you know, it's like cooking. If you eat a really great cake, you're like, oh, I want the recipe and I want to make that cake. It was the same with me with writing. So I loved short stories, obviously prose, generally novels as well. And then there was this moment when I just got obsessed with this, a lot of the American tradition of the contemporary short stories. And I taught a short story course, an American short story course, and I learned so much through teaching those short stories to my students because I had to really deeply analyze them. And one thing I realized was that I could, well, Flannery O'Connor is my favorite writer, and she is, also, I learned a lot from her, and also in the sense of how you can use the local idiom and how you should not stray from what is specific about what you write about. It's in the language, also in the names, it's in the geography, it's in the behavior, everything. Just do not stray from the local idiom. It's what gives the text color, because all stories have been told. It's just the way in which you tell the story and where you said it that makes it different. So I learned that from her, and I also learned how her cynicism suited me, because I also felt constrained in my environment as well, and I felt angry. I'm still angry, actually, and the anger I vented in kind of through humor, or sometimes through criticism of particular characters, through making them grotesque. And I love that, actually. Every time I read a story or a book like that, I get extremely excited, because it's an extreme feeling, I think. So I learned from the Americans in that sense, and then I just applied it to my own culture, using, never straying away from, I don't know, difficult names. My name, apart from Medin Mehmedinovic's, is also the longest name. And my mother had this complex. My mother is Greek, and it's strange because Greeks made us change our name from Macedonia to North Macedonia. My mom also tried to change my name from Rumena to Nena, because she felt that foreigners would not be able to say my name. What happens if foreigners are not able to say my name? I will never be able to integrate into the world. I had to have this kind of whatever. And even nobody in the States, no one could say Nena either. They were like, Nini, Nena, Nana. I was like, I should have said my name was Anne or something if they wanted to pronounce it. But then I just got really angry. I thought, look, my whole life I've read all sorts of novels in all sorts of different languages and cultures. even when there was, passages in there that were never translated, they were in Spanish, or, the Russians, they did all this French stuff in the 19th century. Like, all of these Russian novels have huge passages in French. Cormac McCarthy does that in Spanish as well. I never complained. Nowadays, there's Google, too. And sometimes I get American audiences like, oh, maybe you should explain who Karapanja is. Karapanja was this cook. Google it. I'm not going to explain who Karapanja is. Please also just, Google how to pronounce my name or the name of my city. Very frequently it's been like, that's an America-centric thing. Like, I'll have an interview with someone and they'll be like, oh, Rumena comes from Skopje. Just, how difficult is it to Google the capital name, the capital city of my country and see that it's not pronounced Skopje? So, I mean, I think a lot of it in this book, and also especially in my next one, which is called I'm Not Going Anywhere, I really intentionally kind of went, I'm just going to put in all these things that are sometimes even difficult to pronounce. And then I was translating it with an American translator who doesn't speak Macedonian. He's a translator of Taiwanese poetry. We're great friends, and I translated it into English, and then he worked on it, he edited it, and sometimes he was like, I have no idea what this means. And it would be an interesting perspective, because he's in his, he's 70. And perhaps he was used to this idea that, we would adapt our texts. And I said, I'm not adapting. And I think that's the beauty of why I would, love to read this, or I'd like to read any of the books that are in this, that we've talked about in the past day or two, because I want to learn about the places and the names and the cultures of those spaces. But it doesn't mean that they can't be influenced by any literature. It's just what you're reading at the time. It's
fascinating because we live in an age of globalization.
Yeah.
There's the question of like, what is the international novel? Something that risks eliminating local particularities out of that, the desire for that shortcut to be global and readily accessible, and that you can be sold instantly and easily translated everywhere. And at the same time, it's curious because as I listen to you, I think of the same kind of conversation among African writers concerning the role of glossing in the fiction. To what extent do you use the African terms without explaining? When do you substitute things into the colonial language? When do you leave it behind? And it's an internal conversation.
Yeah.
Internal gigantic continent with different languages, but for many writers, that question of like, to what extent do you allow the terms that are a part of that everyday reality, the place in a fiction that is largely going to be right? Maybe it's the contradiction of writing in some ways for two audiences. That on the one hand you have a large, base of readers or potential to teach and publish in optimally the Anglosphere, but that means also in the United States and in Europe, where some of these things are better funded, and you have middle classes who may be looking for it and interested in it. And then on the other hand, writing for the population writing honestly out of where you are from and for who you are from without stilting everything and skewing it.
It doesn't work if you stilt or skew it. It becomes bland. Because they, in England or America, they have their own writers who are accessible to them in terms of the understanding and of the text. Why would I try to be something that I am not to cater to this kind of audience?
Yeah, it's the curse of representation and expectation. Really, I feel like writers who come from outside the West and write about their respective cultures, it's more likely that their work will be read representatively, and because it's not like there are as many examples out there or novels about the recent history of Kosovo. So when the one is published, then the expectations are that it will be correct in history, correct in terms of the different communities in the country and whatnot, and it really spoke to me what you said about like feeling angry and this frustration, and and we were talking about reading and books, and I feel like the more I read and write, the less angry I get somehow at the world for the evil in it, and for the evil that has happened to myself too. And I feel like on the page I can be courageous and brave and angry and frustrated freely. This is something I'm not necessarily available or able to do outside my writing. And
yeah, that's true. It's the same for me. Though I think it liberated me, because then I also started doing activist stuff a lot back home, and it got me in trouble with the church and some right-wing groups. And now when I get a death threat, I'm like, oh, I'm doing something good. You know,
you get used to those.
Yeah, they're always actually very disconcerting. Like when they start, you know, they know exactly what they're doing. You know, they have bots, so they'll start attacking you. And they know, like I know sometimes, like if I suddenly get like 40 or 50 follows or friend requests, and then I suddenly got like 5 or 6 messages from random people in my inbox, I know that there's someone from these like Steve Bannon-y types in America or whatever, like this kind of right-wing media portal fascist, whatever, who will post something about me, and then he'll have his flock go and attack me online. And so I know that I thought, oh, you know, it makes me stronger. Actually, it really hurts. And sometimes you just have to stop reading it, because it's abuse. But on the other hand, I know that I'm doing something good. But it's the books that liberated me, because when I had to start talking about this in public, it was, yeah, it just, I thought, oh, okay, people are actually responding, and I'm not alone, obviously. It's a community of people who feel and who have been liberated, I'm sure, by your book in many ways.
Yeah, and this is, I think that this idea of your confrontations and battles in life making you stronger is bullshit. So we have been lied to, because I just think they work the opposite. They just make you sometimes weaker and less prepared for the next disaster.
It makes me anxious, actually.
Yeah,
it's made me really jumpy. Yeah. Yes, it's made me anxious, yes. Less afraid, but more anxious.
Well, I don't know if this is going to be a source of anxiety, but I think we have time for questions. If those in the audience would like to ask any. And I can't see, so.
There's.
Yes, oh, wait, I saw that hand, yes.
Oh, thank you for this wonderful it was deep, some of the comments that were made. I have experienced myself some as being a migrant and living in a foreign country that became mine. I wonder when it comes to writing, if you feel that your horizon, even if you come from, as you said, a country that might not be, or a language that might not be, you know, the main global one, do you feel that your horizon, a cultural horizon, has been more what you have lived when you were young, with your surrounding, your neighborhood? Or do you feel that the dominant, there is some kind of a dominant global environment that is your horizon, and that somehow you're fighting not for your own quote-unquote little problems, but for more of a human cause, and that you are not really always yourself, or have a very specific identity, although you seem to be an activist about it somehow, and yet, okay. Maybe my question is clear enough.
Yeah. Do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, throughout my life, I've been asked about my identity and how I identify myself, because I moved to Finland when I was 2 years old from Kosovo, and so I have no memories of the time before Finland, and I have no memories of learning Finnish or Albanian, because they were both my mother tongues almost, I thought. I spoke Albanian at home and then Finnish outside my home, and it really, oftentimes I feel like in cases like mine, they are giving me like this favor or this luxury of option to choose between the two identities and to define myself Finnish or Albanian, but there's really no option to me, because if I say, okay, I'm Finnish, and then I will not ever be Finnish in many ways, and then if I say that, okay, I'm Albanian or a Kosovo Albanian, and it's still a failed attempt to many to be Albanian, so I've just given up on the subject, and I don't care anymore, because I feel like I don't even know what identity is clearly, and in my books I play around with this fluidity, this constant change, this escape from this choice. For example, my second book is about a pathological liar who moves from one country to another and constantly reinvents himself. He lies about his background. He says that, oh, I'm Spanish, but then the next day he's, oh, I'm German, and the next day he's a woman, and the next day he's a man, and that's because he's, in the same way, stripped down for the power, for the option. I don't know if this answers the question, but
yeah. I think with the horizons, it's also what I was talking about in terms of, you know, the local idiom. There's the way in which you get to the universal is through the local. I think we all have the same problems. And, you know, as an activist in terms of, I don't know, women's rights, which I talk about a lot, I see many similarities everywhere. I mean, we all live in a patriarchal system. So I don't, you know, I feel somehow lucky that I am from a place that's small and complicated, but I have this openness to visit. I mean, I have this access towards the world as well. But I honestly enjoy the complication of my identity, and I really, because the passage that you read with the different languages, you know, that it's seen sometimes in Western values, especially in American values, as you know, as a shortcoming. You speak more than one language. You only speak English. Oh, ooh, this is bad. Whereas, you know, we speak so many languages, which means you're exposed to so much knowledge, and that's how your horizons become different. And I'm an optimist when I speak to people. Before I go to bed, I'm a horrible pessimist. And when I wake up, but in general, it's like always a battle between the two. I don't think that we can survive if we don't have this kind of optimism, but I enjoy this identity.
Yeah, living in between different worlds and religions and languages, I think it has made me more sensitive to people and to different people, and maybe more understanding.
Surely.
Understanding too.
And that's why you're right. I mean, especially these topics are. I can talk to you later. I was like, blah, blah, blah. Can I
just... if I may, you have clarified somehow my question in the sense that, is there a risk when we have that option to escape somehow or just be forced out of identity to be the target somehow of the hegemonic culture, which may be the one of the strongest, aren't we somehow forced into some universal questions that might be more American or more Chinese at the moment, without knowing it?
Yeah, I think you're always forced. It's you're leaving the zone of comfort, and then someone is always looking at you as the other, and that's it. And you have to deal with it. So it's always a forceful way of having to be looked at.
Yeah, and when you come from a place that is known for its brokenness or the war,
Yeah.
or you're not an other in the same way than, for example, an immigrant who moves to Finland from, let's say, Switzerland or Germany.
It's not an immigrant, that's an expat.
Yeah, that's an expat, exactly. Yeah. So there's different language that's used, and in this passage, because the children speak Albanian, because that's their second language, and that is the reason why it's seen as a default, but then going on in the book, they don't see the Swedish-speaking children the same way, although they are bilingual as well. And
yeah. Oh, there's more.